This is going to be a bit of a change of pace. I'm going to have to reflect on what type of an institution is MCC. What type of an institution can do the types of things that MCC tries to do, and what are the challenges that we face trying to link what are essentially policy and fundamentally politically oriented investments, international investments, in a world that really should be founded on good scientific principles. And I'm going to walk through some of the challenges that we face, many of which are simply practical challenges, which have been quite a struggle for us to overcome. But I want to keep it tied to the focus of this conference, which is how do you use good scientific methods? How do you ensure that transparency does what it needs to do to try to establish good policies and good investments? The title of the paper has evolved into Responsible Transparency, and it is just going to be a discussion of what these challenges have been. I've been helped enormously in sort of thinking through these issues, and especially in trying to document what our findings have been, by my colleagues Stephanie Birch, Heather Hansen, and Jennifer Sturdy especially. MCC was started by an act of Congress back in 2004 with strong bipartisan support. In the current political environment, bipartisan support is a very elusive thing. It was no less in those days. I tell the story that George Bush had this interest in trying to change how development money was spent, U.S. government development money was spent, and found that it was extremely difficult to change the direction of what USAID did, and they came up with the idea of coming up with a corporatized approach to international development, an approach where resources would be provided based on what sorts of deliverable results could be achieved. It reflected an important focus on enhancing economic development opportunities in the poor part of the world. And so the Democrats in Congress found it a very palatable approach, and an agreement was forged, and MCC was created. That bipartisan support was really built around this idea that everything needed to be evidence-based, that MCC needed to be able to demonstrate the types of results that it was achieving. And the focus needed to be on reducing poverty through sustained economic growth. That bipartisan support is still there. We still, under the Obama administration, in fact, we got still more accolades because of our focus on good use of evidence, the use of impact evaluations, trying to ensure that we build in good management feedback through the collection of evidence. And so that coalition is still important. The bipartisan support still requires a real evidence-based and an evidence-based approach and a strong anchoring in accountability. The way that MCC works, 90% of the money that's given in aid to developing countries is given in the form of grants to partner countries. We have a very specific, again, evidence-based approach to determining what countries are appropriate for receiving MCC's funds. And we engage with our partner governments on making investments that they agree are appropriate for reducing poverty through sustained economic growth. But they do it according to standards that MCC establishes to ensure financial accountability as well as good evidence-based decision-making. The commitment to transparency within MCC really responds to both this requirement for accountability, giving the public good evidence of what money was spent on, whether or not the things that it was spent on was actually purchased, and then assessing whether or not those things that we purchased actually brought about the types of changes that we were trying to achieve. The commitment to transparency obviously also links back to the broad interest in scientific discovery. Can our evaluators measure impacts in a credible way? For them to be credible, those results really need to be replicable. But the other thing that we want to do is we collect a lot of data in settings that are very data poor. We want the data that we collect to be useful both for our evaluations, but they very often open up new research opportunities that were not intended initially, and we want that sort of public good aspect of the data to be available as widely as possible. Another advantage of the transparency approach is it gives our partner governments the information that they need in order to be able to better understand and manage the investments and to better learn what it is that works in the process of development. And it's also a way that we can coordinate better with donors, the other major donors who are trying to invest in road systems and other things. What we spend, what we invest in, we want to be part of a combined international effort to overcome significant constraints to growth. Dealing with transparency and results in the environment in which MCC works introduces challenges that this audience, I think, can easily understand, but it's probably not part of what you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Things like we have to deal with the fact that data has different definitions to different people. I remember when I was working at RAND many years ago, and there was a second round of the Indonesian Family Life Survey had recently been collected, and somebody had asked to see the data, and they were taught where to download the household survey data. And the anecdote is she loaded it into Word somehow and could not make any sense of the data. I saw it in my years of working I saw this same sort of problem of interpretation of data in work that I did when I was in Indonesia, where people would talk about data as the reports. I'd been a number nerd. I loved digging through the microdata and was just astounded that the term data was something that you opened up on a page, not something that you necessarily analyzed. This is a world that we work in. Lots of people that we work with are not aware of the intricacies and the meaning of the microdata that's important to us. Transparency and results also interact in strange ways when you get into government situations where we are accountable to Congress for the money that we spent, for taxpayer money. Reputational risk ends up being a big issue within any agency that has to face Congress on a year-by-year basis. And the challenge that MCC faces is that we do report on how we spend the money. We do report on actual results from our evaluations, and you will not be surprised to hear that those results are not always good. We, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we got one of the first cohort of agriculture evaluation results came out. We had 5 different agricultural farmer training results that came out at about the same time. And those results are best described as mixed. Some of them were good. Some of them were not so good. And most disappointingly, being on the side of MCC that's actually involved in helping implement the evaluations, some of the evaluations were just totally uninformative. They were evaluations that had just not worked. there was a significant challenge with how are we going to do that? How are we going to deal with this? What happens when Congress sees these things didn't work? Mercifully, the management of MCC recognized that this was indeed the model that MCC was built for, and that we were able to transform these mixed results into very clear opportunities to improve what it was that we did. And the reality is we had lots of opportunities to improve what we do. The institution had to learn to use those results, not to show that they were good, but to use the results to show how to get better. And that was a very hard thing for the different levels within MCC to come to terms with. It's a whole lot more work to change what you do than it is to simply try to be able to assert that you're great. These issues are very, they feed into the challenge that we have trying to align incentives. How do we try to make sure that everybody within the institution has a shared interest, not only in implementing programs well, but in making sure that we know what actually happened within those investments. And it can be a challenge because it is a burden. It is hard to do. It's, in terms of total cost, the money that we put into the evaluations is a pretty small portion of our portfolio, but they are very often obstacles to implementing the programs. If you don't have to worry about reporting on things, if you don't worry about keeping close tabs on how the program is actually implemented, it's much easier to implement the programs. This is a quick slide that discusses some of these issues of the different types of data that we have. My story today is going to be about microdata. The reality is we work in a world where lots of other types of data are important to our stakeholders. So far, the focus is on microdata, but as we start talking about the issues of data transparency, the different types of data that we're engaged in, our financial data, the economic rates of return that drive our decisions, these are all very important parts of the data that MCC develops and MCC is guided by, and they're very much part of what we have to put out to explain what we've done. As we start focusing on microdata, the data that you cannot put into into Microsoft Word, the key data that have ended up being a real challenge for us to work with are personally identifiable information. When we go to collect data, MCC, although we're a young institution, started just 10 years ago, the infrastructure that has been in place in federal statistical agencies was not there from the start. We did not have institutional review boards. MCC, even to this day, is not a signatory on the Common Rule for Protection of Human Subjects. There is an agreement within MCC that we subscribe to the principles of the Common Rule, but in fact, the policies that would need to be in place to adhere strictly to the Common Rule would be an enormous burden for an institution of MCC size. We're 300 people, and we just don't have the supporting infrastructure to be fully compliable with it. The microdata, the personally identifiable information, are the types of data which we tell our respondents that we will keep these protected, that we will not share these with others. This ends up being a challenge to trying to create replicable results. It ends up being a challenge because many of these identifiable characteristics will be things that are fundamentally needed to do good, high quality, and robust analytic work. It's not the names, that's not an issue that we worry so much about. We can remove the names from files and not lose their analytic capabilities. but trying to conceal the number of hectares that the largest landowner within a particular community owns means that analysts will not be able to distinguish the behavior of someone with 100 hectares versus the other large landowners that have 50. So a farmer who has 500 heads of cattle rather than 200. In order to protect the identity of respondents, we do need to top code these types of data. And we are concerned that that can be a constraint to replicating results. Obviously, other sensitive data, income, assets, health status, these are all things that could put respondents at risk. So we face a set of unique challenges. Many of these will be familiar with you. I think the combination of them is what makes it quite difficult. We have an ethical obligation to protect respondents from harm. We have the ethical obligation to honor our promises of confidentiality. On the legal side, MCC has very unusual challenges, and that is U.S. federal laws obviously do not have any bearing on the countries that we work within. So we have to work within an environment where the host country laws about protections of privacy and so on are relevant. But there is a strange thing that happens even within the U.S., and that is laws like FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, allows U.S. citizens to request access to data that the U.S. government has paid for. Can we say, no, you can't have this because it's personally identifiable information? Well, if it were data on U.S. residents, yes, we would be protected by data laws. But these are not U.S. residents. It's not clear that we can promise that even the U.S. has legal protections to say that we can refuse to respond to a FOIA request because it's personal identifiable information. We might be able to survive it, but our Office of General Counsel has said those are unclear things. We need to be very careful about what we can promise to respondents. The practical challenges that we face, I think, are ones that this audience is much more familiar with. To get good data, you need to establish trust. And that trust means you need to be able to say that the tax administration within the Philippines will not be able to require that the data that was collected from businesses responding to our surveys cannot be required to be turned over in Philippine courts. We don't have any control over what can be required in Philippine courts. So we're in a bit of a limbo about several of these things. These are issues that we're only now starting to identify as requirements that we perhaps could establish as requirements within our compacts, within our agreements with partner countries, because during the life of our compacts, those agreements have the force of law. We could require our partner countries to say that commitments of privacy will be protected in local courts. It's a tough negotiation we'd have to do, but even if we accomplished that, it would only work through the life of the compact, because our agreement with a foreign government ends at the end of our 5-year compacts. So we do have this limbo that we have to work with. And then finally, we need to make sure that we've got the resources and the capabilities to provide the data that we need. So we've got multiple competing objectives. We want to limit the risk. We want to limit the exposure, both that MCC has by promising things that we can't deliver on, but we want to limit risk to our respondents as well. We want to maximize the replicability of our results, and we want to make sure that the data are as useful as possible. So we've done a number of things. We've implemented another. I'm going to drag you through some of the things that we have managed to accomplish, and I'll leave you with some of the challenges we still face. One of the things that we've done within the last couple of years is we have established standard data protection principles. Basically, we require IRB reviews of data that we collect. We make sure that if we're holding on to any sorts of personally identifiable information, it actually is needed for the purpose of the study. And we try to establish a standard informed consent template that does not overpromise what we can do in terms of protecting privacy. We also need to work with our partner governments, our partners within the implementation of these things to protect access to data, both in its collection, in its local storage in the countries we're working in, and among the different parties that have to handle and analyze the data. And we need to make sure that just the procedures they follow, locking file cabinets and stuff, are followed. Another action that we've been I don't want to overstate the accomplishments, that we've made great progress on is establishing approaches for getting the data into the public domain. So we have established a set of data documentation and anonymization guidelines, benefiting enormously from assistance from the World Bank and the International Household Survey Network that's based there. We have mechanisms for putting our data and our analytic results into the public domain. It uses open source software, all XML-based stuff. Everything ends up being completely searchable. And we have mechanisms that now allow for secure and organized presentation of the data. The cataloging system gives us mechanisms for distributing all of the data. We've established a disclosure review board. Disclosure review boards exist in all of the federal statistical agencies to deal with the issue of protecting privacy and making sure that data that is put into the public domain has been adequately scrubbed to minimize the risk of identification of sensitive data. It was a bit of a heavy lift for people who work in the development field to figure out how to put this in place. And they're difficult decisions that we have to make all the time when you work in a country where identifying what community has high rates of girls' school enrollment actually might need to be considered a risky bit of data to put out there. So we have established anonymization packages, we've got standard worksheets, and we're working with our evaluators to think carefully through the sorts of known risks that are out there and to consider plausible unknown risks that we need to deal with. Throughout this process of reviewing data before they go into the public domain, we have to struggle with this idea that we're trying to both get data as useful as possible and get as much data into the public domain as we can, while trying to ensure minimal risk to our respondents. The last action that we have made significant progress on, but remains a significant challenge, is creating restricted access data to potential researchers. We really want the data that we collect. We want let me restate that. We want the richness of the data that we collect to be accessible to good statistical research. We do face significant challenges. The fact that FOIA requests leave us in a little bit of limbo about what we can actually request and what we can refuse to others. But we have established an approach towards restricted access data, which allows partially anonymized data to be put into to be made accessible to requesting analysts. So this is all going into databases. It's going into our public-facing website. It's moving out relatively slowly. We have about 20 or so of our total evaluations that already have data and appropriate documentation in them. That's a small portion of our portfolio. We've got about 170 different evaluations that are underway. Most of the evaluations that we do will have microdata associated with them. We do expect all of these to be put into the public domain eventually. But it is a challenge, and we work in an environment where these challenges are tough to deal with. Staffing and resources have been one of the issues that we've made pretty good progress on. The MCC staff and the MCA, our counterpart organizations within our partner countries, the staff, we try to ensure that the M&E staff has adequate training, that there's the appropriate management in place, that contracts for data collection firms are properly written to ensure appropriate handling of sensitive data, to get adequate documentation, and to make sure that the data that are collected are appropriately submitted to our disclosure review board for review. The MCC has been generous in making sure that we do have at least a couple of people who keep the DRB process moving along. We also have been able to add on the requirements for adequately documenting and anonymizing data to the independent evaluators. It is all of our evaluations are done by independent contracted evaluators, and so they are the ones who end up doing the heavy lifting on this. They faced marginal but very measurable increases in time and costs in order to ensure that they got proper IRB reviews and that they were able to put together anonymized data packages to the DRB for review. But it's something that they've agreed to and that we've been able to fund appropriately. And finally, we've been able to benefit from other U.S. government statistical agencies who've been through these DRB processes, who have set up things both in the Department of Census and the Health and Human Services. We've gotten excellent guidance. They've helped us enormously think through some of these particularly difficult challenges. Lessons that we've gotten out of this include huge insights from these statistical agencies we've worked with, other research institutions, obviously the World Bank and the International Household Survey Network has helped us enormously with procedures, but the research community, the developed world research community has been, I think, our most important partner in this. We've established clear principles about what we require, the IRB requirements, informed consents, and so on. These are essential to what we do. It is clear that not all data are equal. The firm-level data about taxes paid and income actually earned within firms is a far more sensitive issue than figuring out how many cattle are on different farms. And getting the balance right in these different settings has been a really critical lesson for us. And then finally getting the word out to our partners about the importance of the data that we're collecting and trying to make sure that these are well represented. We're not done. This issue of data ownership is going to be a difficult one. I've mentioned to you that laws differ between countries, but the other issue is the data that are collected, they are intellectual property. Most of the data are collected with funds that have been granted to our partner countries, so the intellectual property is owned by our partner country. Does our partner country have the same privacy protection standards that we do? We want them to. The data are theirs. So our success at protecting privacy is really going to depend on our ability to promote this common set of principles. Long-term enforcement of privacy protections is a real issue, given that even if we can get explicit agreements with our partners, those agreements only last for the period of our 5-year compacts. And finally, I've already pointed out to you the legal limitations on MCC's, potential legal limitations on MCC's ability to protect privacy. These are the challenges we face. It's not easy, but it is what we're trying to do to put these data into the public domain. And I hope you get to use lots of it. Thank you.